Well, today I'm going to give a share, a special share, but I'm going to do something somewhat different. Every once in a while I give an overview share to review that which I've said before so that you can grasp the picture, the total picture. Because in any specific display of information, there are two things that always have to be given. The main thing that has to be given is what's called the details. And what you do is you enumerate the various details of the system. But the most important thing is the picture itself. All the details come together to form a picture. And that picture is somewhat separate from the details. And it's only when you have the details and the picture that it forms, or in other words, the foreground, the actual picture, the actual details, and the background, which is the picture, the overall picture, can you grasp any specific topic. So what I'd like to give today is an overview, but I want to do something different. I want to attach the overview of some of the fundamental concepts in Hashkafa and Kabbalah, since this is a Shir and the Nimshal of Kabbalah, on the reference, what the Kabbalah, the meaning of the Kabbalah. But what I want to do is, I want to give a shir at the same time on the 10 Sefirot. For the first time, I've never really given a shir on this to you guys, but I want to go over each of the 10 Sefirot and tell you how it relates to the overall picture. So this will be a very powerful presentation. You'll not only be able to understand the overall picture of the Kabbalah, but you'll also be able to understand how it manifests itself in the Sefirot, the specific energies, the 10 energies of the midas of God, of the attributes of God. So this is the nature of the program itself. When you look at all the Sefirot, there are 10 of them. What exactly is a Sefirot? A Sefirot is an energy. It's an energy designed to accomplish a specific task. As such, the Sefirot are called midos. It's attributes. They are the 10 attributes which God uses as the manifestation of His Ratzon, the will of God. Of course, to understand who God is Himself is absolutely impossible, because God is not subject to any concepts. He cannot be reduced to a concept or to a group of concepts. So fundamentally, all we can know about God is His Ratzon, His will. What does He want? And how does He want to accomplish this? That we can understand, and that's called Ritzonai, or His will. So God accomplishes what He wants, His will, through certain energies, and there are 10 energies in total. And these energies actually perform the will of God and affect all that God wants to affect in the world. So when we look at the 10 Sefirot, we see that actually they divide into 5 different parts. In other words, if we categorize all 10 of them, we see that there are 5 categories which apply to the 10 Sefirot. So therefore, I'm going to be discussing the 10 Sefirot in terms of these 5 categories. The first category is called the world of the Mum. In other words, what God did was that He created a Zulasai, a recipient of Olam Haba. But what He said was that in this recipient called a Zulasai, there is a mum, or a defect, or a flaw. So the first concept is, what exactly is this flaw? I've discussed this a number of times, and I want to discuss the outline again the second time. The second program, the second world, is not, the first world is the world of the flaw, or the mum. A word mum means a defect. The second category of the spheres is called the world of correction. In other words, God, having observed this flaw existing in the Zulosoi, wants to correct it. So therefore, this is the world called the world of correction. And this applies, the world of correction applies to the sphere of Kesser, the first sphere of the 10. So the first sphere of the 10 is really the beginning of a program to correct this flaw. And therefore develops a complete program to do it. The other 9 spheres represent the actual program, the execution of the actual program to correct the flaw that's observed in the beginning. This flaw, of course, is called Dekesufah. Dekesufah is a certain flaw in the Zulosoi that makes it fundamentally impossible to give it the destiny that God has in store for it. But the sphere or the energy, the attribute, which actually deals with this flaw in terms of its correction, is called Kesser. The other 9 spheres after Kesser, therefore, represents the implementation of the correction. So the program of correction is dominated, is supervised by Kesser, the first sphere. The other 9 spheres deals with the implementation of this corrective process. The second sphere is Chokhmah, and the third sphere is Bina. Chokhmah and Bina develop the beginning of the implementation. They create the fundamentals which are necessary in order to achieve the correction. So therefore, this is the world of fundamentals. Chokhmah and Bina, the second and third sphere, are really create the fundamentals which perform the correction. So they are the beginning of the implementation. The next 6 spheres is called the world of execution. In other words, we now have the fundamental program, and we have the fundamentals which exist to perform the correction of Dekesufah. But the execution of that program is done by the next 6 spheres: Chesed, Gevurah, Tiferes, Netzach, and Hod, and Yesod. These are 6 spheres, one after another, which are responsible for the execution of the process of correction of Dekesufah. And finally, we have the last sphere, which is Malchus, or actually, in a certain sense, Yesod and Malchus together, really have to do with the actual implementation of the execution and for the accomplishment of the result. So that's the world of Ishtadlus. So therefore, the 10 spheres are divided into 5 categories. It's divided into the category of the program of correction, Kesser, the program of the fundamentals, which are required for the correction, and that's called the world of fundamentals. That's Chokhmah and Bina. And finally, the execution.
Yeah, this is going to work.
Could you please silence your online shur? And the next 5 have to do really, the next 5 spheres, which has to do with Chesed, Gevurah, Tiferes, Netzach, and Hod. This has to do with the execution of the correction of Dekesufah. And finally, that execution is done fundamentally, to a large extent, by the Zulosoi, called the world of Ishtadlus, which is governed by the spheres of Yesod and Malchus. So we see what the 10 spheres are. The 10 spheres are the energies which accomplish in existence the program of correction of Dekesufah. And all of these 10 spheres together comprise fundamental concepts that are in the Kabbalah. So when we understand exactly these 10 spheres and what they do, we will have achieved a specific understanding of how this is done, how the problem of Dekesufah is corrected by these energies and forced to deliver the result. So this is fundamentally the organization of the 10 spheres. So first of all, therefore, let's talk about Dekesufah. What exactly is the correction about? What is the flaw in the Zulosoi that requires correction? That's really the question. In a certain sense, I'm not going to say, but this has to do with the world of the Rishimu and Simpson and so on, and even that pre-Simpson. But I'm not going to itemize that now. We're just going to talk about the actual problem that the Zulosoi has in the world of what the Ratzon, the will of God, wants to achieve. Fundamentally, the basic concept of this, and the most important concept in all of Hashkafa, is the notion that the Zulosoi, what exactly is the Zulosoi? Well, in my opinion, the Zulosoi is nothing more than an entity of self-awareness. That's right. In other words, the truth is, if you look at the Zulosoi like a human being, you say to him, well, who are you? So he says to you, so you say to him, are you the body? I see you as a body. Your appearance is as a body. Is that who you are? So he would say, no, I'm not my body. So then you would say to him, okay, then what are you? So he would say to you, take off your body, and you would get out of your body. And he says, oh, I see you have a soul. Are you a soul? And you would say, no, I'm not a soul. So he would say to you, well, then take off your soul, or get out of your soul, just like you've gotten out of your body. And this must be you. And the answer is yes. So we see that the person or the Zulosoi is neither a body or a soul. He's something beyond. What is that? So he is beyond the concept of what? He's beyond the concept, and he is of an entity in a sense, and he is actually an entity of consciousness. The Zulosoi in his inner sense of himself is really nothing more than an entity of self-awareness. Now, why did God create this? Why did God create this self-awareness? Well, he created this self-awareness as a gift because he wants this entity of self-awareness called the Zulosoi to coexist with him. And since God exists beyond eternity and so on and into eternity, fundamentally what God has in mind is that this Zulosoi should coexist with him for eternity, which is an astounding gift. Because even though the Zulosoi is not God and doesn't become God, but in a certain sense, he is somewhat less than God. Like David HaMelech says, man is slightly less than Elokim, which is an aspect of God and so on. And it says that therefore man can actually exist for eternity. What exactly is eternity? What does God have in mind? Well, eternity is a state of what existence which is beyond time. There is no time in eternity. Eternity is not simply the accumulation of time, a million, a billion, a trillion, and so on, years, but actually it's the absence of time. It's when existence is extant without the dimension of time. And God has in mind that this Zulosoi, which is a really a being of self-awareness or consciousness, can exist with him eternally. Now, fundamentally, God himself is also a being of what? Of consciousness. But we cannot grasp the nature of this being, because God, in essence, does not possess a consciousness. He is consciousness. God's essence and his consciousness are one. Whereas we possess a certain consciousness, and that defines us, God does not have that as a definition. He's beyond that definition of consciousness and self-awareness. But we know that he possesses it, and he gave us the gift of that. He derived the Zulasa from his consciousness and gave us the gift of consciousness. And he wants to coexist with this consciousness because he can coexist with this consciousness for eternity. What exactly is this self-awareness? What exactly do we mean, God, that the Zulasa is an entity of consciousness? Well, we define the Zulasa as a being who is aware of himself. He has self-knowledge. He has the knowledge of what? He has the knowledge that he exists. That's right. In other words, when you close your eyes and you're no longer in touch with reality as such, what are you in touch with? Well, you are in touch with the property that you exist. You know yourself. Inside your mind, your consciousness reveals the notion of itself. That the entity called the Zulasa is a very strange entity. That entity, through its self-awareness, it has a knowledge of its self-awareness. It has a knowledge of what? Of the fact that it exists. And this particular entity is called itself. ITSELF. The entity of itself is the essence of the Zulasa, in which it knows, in which it has a knowledge of itself that it exists. So therefore, the existence of the entity called the Zulasa does not come from anywhere else. It comes from its inner being. So in a certain sense, we say that the existence of the Zulasa comes from the itself. It knows that it is. And therefore we say that its existence is intrinsic. It's not outside of it, it's inside of it. Now this is very abstract. It's hard to understand what we mean by this. But what we mean is that the Zulasa has a knowledge of itself by itself. And I call this feature of the Zulasa, this gift from God, which comes from God, the itself. It's an entity which is completely capable of knowing that it is, that it exists. Now this entity of existence, where it carries its own existence, where it's intrinsic, has a certain problem. And the problem is that it feels independent. In other words, the knowledge that it exists by itself makes it fundamentally somewhat independent. Independent of who? Independent of God. So when it is aware of God, it's suddenly aware of something outside of it. That's right. The Zulasa, being the being of self-awareness, where it has the knowledge of itself, sees God as a you. In other words, God is another entity outside of it, or so it appears to the Zulasa. And this creates a tremendous problem. Because since it sees God as an outside entity, where it sees itself as me, and it sees God as a you, it therefore believes in a false conclusion that God is outside. But we know clearly from the Torah, because it says, Eino Muvadoi, that there's nothing but God. And what does this mean? Anything else but God? It means there's no other entity. There's no other consciousness. There is nothing outside of God. So everything which God created is inside of God. Einoid Muvadoi, there's nothing but him, means that he has no outside. But yet the Zulasoi, because he has a sense of himself by himself alone, it seems that he is outside of God. And this is a false conclusion. And by believing in something which is false, that he is disconnected from God in the sense that he's capable of knowing God outside of him, is a false conclusion. And this false conclusion makes it impossible for the Zulasoi to coexist with God. Because in the world of God, in order to coexist with him, you have to know the absolute truth that there is nothing outside of God. There is nothing beyond God. So this is what we mean when we say, Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. This is what we mean when we say there is only one God. No, what does that mean by one God? There is nothing outside of him. So the number one doesn't even apply to him, because the number one indicates the number two, the number three. But God is beyond the world of number. He is not even the number one, because there's absolutely nothing outside of him, and he is actually totally synonymous with his existence. He doesn't have existence. God does not possess existence. God is existence. And we see this from the name of God. Yud and the Hey and the Vav and the Hey, the four-letter Hebrew name of God. And what does that mean? It comes from the verb to be, liyos. So therefore, the name of God in the Hebrew language is symbolized by the word Mr. Existence. Well, what kind of name is that? Who has the name of Mr. Existence? God does, because he is the source of existence. Therefore, if anything, his name would be Mr. Existence. But the Zulasoi does not see him as Mr. Existence, because the Zulasoi has the false impression that he is also his own existence. Just like God knows that he exists by himself, the Zulasoi knows that he exists by himself. So in the Zulasoi's mind, he is existence too, but that's not true. And therefore, the consequence of this view or this perception causes annihilation. So therefore, because God created the Zulasoi at such an exalted form, where he's almost outside God, so therefore we can say that the Zulasoi is a single entity, which, if it can be stated, is independent. Most independent is the Zulasoi. The Zulasoi is the greatest thing that God ever created. In fact, God did not create him. God derived the Zulasoi from himself. And the Zulasoi is almost on the level where he's outside of God, but he's not. So therefore, the Zulasoi has a major problem, because it's so exalted in its form, and it was derived from God as the highest creature of all. It actually has the false idea that it's outside of God, from the knowledge of itself, me, you. And this false proposition threatens to annihilate the Zulasoi in terms of coexisting with God. So therefore, in order for God to allow the Zulasoi not to be annihilated, he has to give the Zulasoi the chance to change his perception, to realize that he's not a me and a you, he's not outside of the Zulasoi, and the Zulasoi is not outside of him. But actually, the Zulasoi can be said to be me, and God can be said to be the inner me. In other words, God is located, if you can say so, inside the consciousness of the Zulasoi. It is from God that the Zulasoi has the aspect of consciousness. That in a certain sense, God shares his own consciousness to a certain sense, to that of the Zulosai. So the Zulosai derives his sense of himself from God. So therefore, what the Zulosai has to do is come to the truth of me, inner me. That God is an inner me. There's me, and there's inner me, which is the foundation of God's existence. And if the Zulosai can come to this perception, and not the false perception, he can then coexist with God. So therefore, it's absolutely necessary for the Zulosai to obtain the truth of his relationship with God. And that relationship is that God is not a me-you existence, not a me-you relationship, but rather is a me-inner-me relationship. And this leads to his kiyum. So in other words, we see the fundamental feature or the fundamental task which the Zulosai must acquire. He has to acquire the knowledge of God's unity. That this unity is not simply that there is one God and no one else. There's no other God but God. But there's one being, God, and there's nothing else. Not only is there nothing else in terms of two gods, but there's nothing else, period. So the achdus, the unity of God, is absolute. And the Zulosai must develop this knowledge or this awareness that even though he's aware of himself by himself, he is still not outside of God. And in order for him to coexist with God for eternity, without time and so on, or beyond time, he must obtain the knowledge of this truth. So therefore, God created a complete circumstance, a complete program where this becomes doable. So because of the flaw of Dekesufah, which means bread of shame, where he thinks he's outside of God, God then establishes a complete program where the Zulosai is able to remove this false perception and come to a true perception. And this is the whole purpose of what? Creation, or at least our creation. So therefore, the Kabbalah is the study of this program. The Kabbalah reveals the truth of what the problem is, the mum of the Zulosai. And then the Kabbalah describes the complete program in which God chooses and uses to eliminate this problem called Dekesufah. There is nothing else that we know about God. The entire Kabbalah from beginning to end talks about the process of how to resolve or how to mistaken for a tikkun of Dekesufah. There's nothing else. There's nothing else we can understand of God. And that's what we mean by God's will. We understand with Sinai, his will. And his lesson that he revealed to us is simply about the Zulosai. We have no information about him, nor can we ever have information about him. So all of knowledge is nothing more than the knowledge of what the flaw or the problem is with the Zulosai that interferes with his ability to coexist with God, and how to eliminate this mum. There is no other knowledge. There's no other chokhmah that allows us to understand this. And this is the entire field of the Kabbalah. Now, where do we get the Kabbalah from? Well, fundamentally, the Kabbalah was revealed to Moshe Rabbeinu at Har Sinai. But it's actually revealed long before Moshe Rabbeinu was revealed basically, to a certain extent, to Adam Harishon, to the first man. And God accomplishes this by actually affecting this cause. Now, there's also one more thing that you have to know about this preliminary circumstance of Dekesufah. that because man is so close to God, he resembles him. If anyone resembles God, it is man. Truly resemblance. Because just like God knows himself by himself, man also knows, or the Zolotzer also knows himself by himself. But there's one more thing which is not obvious. When we say that God knows himself by himself, what does that mean? What does that exclude? What is that statement, Einoi Movadoi, there's nothing else for him, coming to exclude? Is it coming to exclude a human being? Is it coming to exclude man? That you know yourself by yourself, but that's not really, even though you know yourself by yourself, you are still inside of me. Not really. It comes to exclude something much more powerful. When we say Einoi Movadoi, there's nothing else but God, we mean there's no other entity outside of God. So what does this mean? Well, fundamentally this means that God has no cause. That's right. In our universe, in the universe of existence, there's what? There's something called cause and effect relationship. Two events occur, and their relationship is one of cause and effect. One is the cause event, and one is the effect event. And everything in the universe that we have, all life, all material, all the galaxies and the stars, all of these things have a cause. Science is nothing more than the study of causes. Science attempts to understand the cause of all the events in the physical universe. So science, therefore, is completely dominated by the notion of cause. But we say that God has no cause. What does that mean? That there's no event that precedes him. There is no event that caused him. Why? Because everything is in God. God is the supreme cause of himself, if I may say. That doesn't mean much. What does it mean to be the cause of yourself? Well, in our mind, it's impossible to cause oneself, because a cause and effect exists as two events, not one event. So to say that God has no cause is simply to say that God is an absolute event, which is neither a cause or an effect. God has no cause. And because this is true, this is not only a definition of God, that he has no cause, but this is the definition of his type of existence. That God exists in a sense, in a space or in a universe that has no cause. So what God says to us, since I have created you to be in my image, you are like me in the sense that you are knowledgeable about your own existence. Therefore, you have to mimic me in another sense. Because you have to change your nature. Because you have a nature. Your nature of the Zolosoi is a sense of self. But that sense of self gives it the false conclusion that I'm outside of you, which I'm not. You have to remove that false claim, and only then can you coexist with me. But you have to remove it without a cause. In other words, you cannot have a cause which is outside of you, which helps you to remove that fallacy. Well, the only way the Zulasa can do that, the only way the Zulasa can deal with its nature and its perception of God, is by being its own cause. But wait a minute, how can you be your own cause? You are either a cause event or an effect event. So how can you be your own cause? Well, that's what God has to establish. And this is the absolute paradox, that the Zulosai has to be his own cause. And in that way, he will mimic God. What does this mean? What does this mean that you have to be your own cause? How is this possible? Well, it's only possible. Why? And this is the exalted being called the Zelusai, that the ability to know oneself, or I should call the existence of the itself, is so high that it can actually be his own cause, at least to some extent. So God says to the Zelusai, you have to change your perception of me from a you to an inner me. That's right. And that change has to come from you. And that means that I have to give you free will. What is free will? Free from who? The answer is free from God. That's what it means. In other words, your determination of who you are has to be free from God himself. It has to be something which only relates to you. It comes from you, not from me. Well, that means that to a certain extent, and this is very difficult to understand, we are somewhat outside of God. You see, this is the thing. For someone to be his own cause and decide himself, he has to be in itself. He has to be completely independent of anything else so that he is his own cause. But yet he's not independent of God. He is part of God. So make up your mind. To be his own cause, he has to be outside of God. And he has to be totally by himself. But to satisfy that his existence is like God, he can't be what? He has to be his own cause. But we know that there is no cause outside of God. And a human being cannot be his own cause. Because Einoid Mubadoi, there's nothing else but God. How do we understand this? How do we understand the Zelusai that in a certain sense it has to be free of God and choose its own destiny? And at the same time, it's inside of God. Make up your mind. Either you're in God or you're out of him. That's called the law of the... And there's no middle ground. So fundamentally, the ability for the self or the Zelusai to be its own cause breaks a certain rule. It's called the law of the excluded middle. Aristotle said that there's only two choices, to be or not to be. Either you exist or you don't exist. And there is no middle choice. There's nothing in between, either being or non-being. That's called the law of the excluded middle, which Aristotle said. So in a certain sense, this is contradicted by the desire of God that what? That the Zelusai be its own cause, even while it's inside God. That seems to be a contradiction. If you're inside God, then you're not your own cause. You are an effect from God. If you are outside of God, then you are your own cause, but that means you're independent of God. But that's impossible, because nothing is independent of God. So the truth is, we cannot grasp this. So the fundamental will of God that we be our own cause and therefore be similar to him cannot be understood. It cannot be comprehended in this life or in this world. Will we truly understand this? Yes. We will understand this in the world where there is no Dekesufah. In the final destiny, when man becomes eternal, he will understand this contradiction, where he can be his own cause and yet be inside of God. In this world, in our existence now, we cannot grasp this contradiction. But that contradiction is symbolized in the concept of free will. To possess free will you have to possess the ability to be outside of God, which is impossible. Yet God says we have free will. You decide by yourself what your nature will be, because your nature is to have a double perception. In other words, when you see your perception of God, you see him as outside of you. But when you think of the truth of God, you are not outside of him, you are part of him. So free will cannot be understood in essence. But God has made this a sine qua non, a necessary proposition, that the only way you can coexist with him and be eternal is to be your own cause. So basically, this is the description of the problem. This is the description of the Dekesufah, which means Nahama means bread, Sufa means the bread of shame. And this is the problem, which must be corrected, which must be eliminated for the Zulosoi to share, in a way, existence with God. So God initiated a program of correction. And with the program of correction comes the concept of the Sefirot. The Sefirot are the energies which are involved in the correction of Dekesufah. That's what they are, and that's all they are. So therefore, all of existence is subsumed in 10 energies. So now I will try and explain, to some extent, what these 10 energies are and how these 10 energies affect the program where the Zulosoi is the cause of his own nature and he fixes Dekesufah. So the energy or the Sefirot which creates the program is called Kessin, which means a crown, and so on. And what does this crown do? It creates fundamentally the whole program of how this correction takes place. Well, first of all, we have to understand something critical. The problem of Dekesufah actually exists as the nature of the Zulosoi. So the nature of the Zulosoi, which is how he behaves and what he's composed of, contains the problem of Dekesufah, where the Zulosoi has two possible views, perceptions of God, either outside or inside. That's what it is. And therefore, the selection of which perception is correct and the confusion about which one is correct is called Dekesufah. But can the Zulosoi really get rid of it? Is that really possible? Well, we see something about the Zulosoi. This is very important to understand, that in the beginning the Zulosoi is called a subject. And what does this mean? The definition of the Zulosoi is called a subject. And what is a subject? A subject is really an entity whose existence or being is intrinsic. In other words, we said that the Zulosoi, what captures his own sense of himself by himself, and that's called the itself. That is the entity, whatever that is the essence of consciousness, and it simply knows that he exists by himself. And in that regard, it's called the subject. This is called intrinsic existence or intrinsic being, where the nature of its being comes from itself. So therefore, I choose to change the word existence. There's no such thing as existence. And this is the thing. In the way we see things, we see that there are two things. We see the concept of essence and the concept of existence. What's the difference? Well, this difference is defined in the following way. Essence tells me what a thing is. That's right. It tells me what is this thing. Like the human being. What is a human being? Well, the essence of a human being is its definition. It tells me what it is. And what the definition of the human being is, that he's a rational animal, that he has qualities of an animal, he is alive, he is sentient, he has senses, and so on, he has substance, and so on. But at the same time, he possesses something which nothing else possesses. And that's the concept of what? That's the concept of rational. He can think. The human being is the only being, the only entity in all existence that can think. So therefore, his definition is a rational being. That's the essence. The essence is nothing more than a list of properties which define that entity. That's right. And these are called essential properties. And that's called an essence. So the definition or the essence of a human being is called by the statement a rational animal. So we see that the essence of something is its definition. If you want to understand the definition of any entity, you look it up in a dictionary. And the attempt of a dictionary is to define the object and so on. Now there's a difference between defining an object and describing an object. So a definition is not really a description. A description defines an object in terms of appearance. It's large or small, it's heavy or light, and so on. And you describe the object. So if I would describe a person, you see it, I would list the properties of a description. But a description is not an essence, because it doesn't tell me what are the properties which make this entity to be what it is. It just tells me how the entity appears. So the appearance of an entity is descriptive. But the definition of an entity is called it's called the essence. So first of all, the essence refers to those properties which define, which tells me exactly what makes this entity to be this entity. And the essence is comprehended by the mind. In a certain sense, the essence of an entity is a definition of what that entity is. It's an image. It's actually an image formed by the mind where I understand what this thing is. And the way I understand it by understanding its properties. And these properties are called essential properties. The second question is what? The second question is not what is this thing, but does it exist? Because even though I can understand a definition, that doesn't mean that the object has to exist. For example, if I describe a certain animal that doesn't exist, or for example, if I described a tape recorder in the 16th century, were there any tape recorders in the 16th century? No. So they didn't exist. But I can still understand the definition of what a tape recorder is. It's a machine which duplicates the audio or the sound effects of an item, of an object, even though that object does not exist. So therefore, the existence of an object does not necessitate its definition. So therefore, there are two fundamental properties of every entity in existence. One, its essence. What is this thing? Two, its existence. The fact that the existence of an item is separate from the existence of an item. So, the essence of an item is what is. The existence of an item is, does it have being or not? If it has being, it's said to exist. If it doesn't have being, it's doesn't exist. And existence is separate from essence. So therefore, this allows a certain thing. It allows me to have what's called multiplicity. In other words, I can have many different entities. Why? Because since existence is a process which is outside of the definition, that process can be given to all kinds of definitions. So there are many entities. Each entity is separate in terms of its definition, but it is the same in the sense of the particular process which gives it existence. So even though all the entities in the universe exist, and they exist in the same way, in the same process, but how they exist, which called its essence, is different for each entity. So therefore we allow what's called multiplicity, because existence is outside of the essence. So therefore there's a concept called multiplicity where many objects share this notion of existence. So this kind of existence, which is a process shared by many different essences, is called extrinsic being or existence. I choose the word existence to describe if the process of being is external to the entity, which is its essence. That's called extrinsic being, or what's called by the word existence. But if the being has its existence is itself the object, it's contained intrinsically in the object. In that case, this is called intrinsic being, or the word manifestation. So the word to be manifest means to possess intrinsic being. It means that you are aware of your being by yourself. This possibility is called to be manifest, because not only do you possess existence, but you possess existence in yourself, through yourself. And therefore this process in intrinsic being is called a manifestation. But if you possess existence outside of yourself, which can then be shared by many other entities, that's called extrinsic being, or the word existence. So therefore, a being which is manifest is called a subject. A being which exists is called an object. And that's a very big definition. Subjects are beings which possess their existence in themselves, which means that their being is part of the subject. That's called a manifestation. And if an entity possesses its existence outside of itself, so then it can share existence with many other objects, and that's called an object. Now it's obvious that the world we live in, the physical universe, is what is a world of existence, because there are many entities, each one sharing the capacity to exist. But in the world of a subject, since it possesses its own existence, it's not really a separate existence. Its existence is not separate from its essence, and therefore it's said to be manifest. It's part of the subject itself. So therefore, what world is this? Where does subjects exist? Our world, our universe, and everything, the physical universe, is composed of all entities that exist. And the spiritual universe is also composed of separate entities which exist. But these entities all have the same process of being, but it's extrinsic. Just like there are many different angels and many different souls, we have many spiritual beings called ruchnius. But these ruchnistic beings possess existence as extrinsic. And the way they can do it, because since existence is extrinsic outside of the essence, you can have many of them. So this is true of the physical universe and the spiritual universe. So therefore we see an amazing thing. The physical and the spirit universe, the world of Ruchnius, the world of Gashmius, is an example of existence where entities exist and multiplicity exists. So the real existence of a Zulasoi is beyond that. Why? Because the Zulasoi has what's called intrinsic being. It's inside the Zulasoi itself. It has knowledge of its own existence, of its own by itself. And that's called the manifestation. Now, where is this world? Where does the world of subjects manifest? Where are these? Where are these things? The answer is they're not in any way close to us. We started out in this world. We originally were subjects. That's right. We had a quote intrinsic being in ourselves. And how many are subjects of this law? One. So therefore, just like God is one, because God is the absolute subject, where He is His existence, to a slightly lower level, we are one. In other words, it's impossible to have two human beings. That's right. It is impossible to have two human beings. Why? Because if you had two people or two human beings, the existence of these two people would be outside of them so that it can be shared. Even though each person would have a different essence, a different definition in terms of his inner nature, but he would share the process of existence with another person. But the truth is that's impossible. So in other words, in the world of God, when God created the Zulasoi, He only created one Zulasoi, not two, because existence was in the form of manifestation where the entity contained its own existence as part of it. And therefore, Adam Rishon, the first man, was the only man that was ever created, because that's the nature of man. Man, because it possesses the property where he exists in himself, can only exist as one, not as many. So Adam Rishon, therefore, was only one man, where all souls originally were tied up into this one man. When Adam Rishon existed, there was no other people except Chava, which really was a piece of him. But nothing else exists. There was no possibility, really, of two people. There was only one person, Adam Rishon Koydem Achet, before the sin. It's only after Adam sinned where suddenly the concept of multiplicity came into effect. Multiplicity was only possible, the possibility of being mankind, where mankind becomes a species, only existed after the sin. So in a certain sense, we see a profound concept that the nature of existence changes as you sin. Because sinning is believing that God is outside of us, that we are not part of God. He is outside and we are outside of Him. And the truth of that statement really causes multiplicity. If we give in to that and so on, when we accept the proposition that God is outside of us, we actually create the concept of multiplicity. Because in a certain way, and this is very, very deep, we create the separation of essence and existence. We create the separation of essence and existence, and therefore allow the possibility of multiplicity. Because since existence is outside of us, therefore we can all share it. But when existence is inside of us, we can't share it. So there can only be one subject, technically. That's right. There can only be one subject, not two subjects. The difference is if there's one subject alone, His existence is inside of him. And if there's two subjects, or the possibility of two, his existence is outside of him. This is very deep. And we begin to understand to some extent the major difference in the perceptions of the Zolosai. When the Zolosai believes that what? That God is outside of him, he is saying that the process of being is called existence. And we share that. We share that with God. And that's called existence, which is intrinsically, extrinsically true. But if the process of existence is inside of us, that means that there cannot be two people. And what does that mean? How is that possible? Well, what that means is that there can only exist an organism. Because an organism is where entities are not separated by their existence. A true organism is an entity which shares its existence with something else. But I'm not going to go into this concept. I will go into this concept later on. But this is a very, very deep concept. So we see something incredible. We really see something incredible. That in the physical universe and the spiritual universe, there's a multiplicity of entities because existence is outside of essence. What were we before this physical world and spiritual world? Well, really we are a certain entity which has an intrinsic existence. But the problem is that because we think we are independent, we have an independent knowledge of our own being, we think that we are outside of God. And this is the problem where God wants us to remove so that we can see him as inside of him, that we are inside of God, that God is inside of us. He is our inner means. But how do we do that? Well, what he does, and this is the program itself, God gives us commandments. The most important commandment is we should love God. And you shall love God. What is love? Love really is the force of unification. When you love someone, you see that true love is when you see someone as part of you. He is not outside of you. The way you know that if you love someone, it's real, is that when you see that other person, you see him as part of you. And this is critical. So if you see someone as outside of you, as being a nice person, but the person is outside of you, you don't really love him. You like him. Liking is when you see a person that's pleasing. But loving someone is when you see another person not simply as pleasing, but you see another person as part of yourself. So therefore, love is a process of unification. That's really what it is. So when God says that you have a commandment to love him, therefore, how is that manifest? The way it's manifest is that what? You see God as part of you. That's right. So from this we see a very powerful concept. That the way Kessin established the program by giving you free will, he says to you, I give you a commandment. Kessin gives the commandment, the Torah, which you have to love God. But in loving God, you will see him as part of you. And therefore, this will eliminate the fallacy where God is outside. That's right. The cure for the fallacy where you see God is outside of you is love. Love. So what you see is a very powerful concept. You don't solve the problem of Dekesufah. How? The only way to solve Dekesufah is by loving God. But you will never get rid of the fact that you see God somewhat as outside of you. that you cannot get rid of. Because if you get rid of that problem, you disappear. The essence of the gift of free will, the essence of the gift of itself is that what? Is that you can see you have a consciousness that exists within you. And since that consciousness exists within you and you'll manifest, you see God, you must see God in a certain sense as outside of you. In other words, you can't get rid of that. Because to have it, the concept of itself, you must see God as outside. Because that comes from the concept of itself. Since you see yourself by yourself, and in a certain sense you are what? You must be outside of him to some degree. Or at least appear in your mind to be outside of him. So therefore we truly never really correct the problem of Dekesufah. Because to correct the problem of Dekesufah, we have to lose the concept of itself. Because it's the gift of itself, that inner core that knows itself by itself, which sees God as outside. So you never really get rid of it. But what you do get rid of it is the Dekesufah, which means disempowerment. That the problem with the Zulasoi is that since he sees God as outside of him, because he sees himself as inside, and therefore he sees God as outside, therefore he feels disempowered. So God said, you must get rid of this feeling of disempowerment to coexist with me forever. That's right. You do not correct the problem of Dekesufah. You do not. You correct the problem of Kesufah. And God says the only way to correct the problem of Kesufah is through love. By doing the mitzvahs that God commands us and being in love with God, we eliminate the problem of what? God being outside. We eliminate, therefore, the disempowerment because we see God as inside of us. You see it. And suddenly we return to the concept of existence as intrinsic. So we see this very powerful concept, what is going on. In fact, this concept is so abstract that it's not easy to truly understand it. But this is the concept of Kessin. Kessin is the energy or the Sefirot, which creates the program where we correct ourselves of the problem of seeing God outside of us, called Dekesufah. But Kessin does not eliminate the Nahama. We must see God as outside because we see ourselves as inside. So we cannot get rid of that. We'd have to get rid of our individuality, our itself, to get rid of the problem. And God does not want to do that because then we would disappear. We would suddenly be decreated. So God says, I have given you the gift of an itself which knows itself by itself. And this is you forever. I don't want to take it away. This is a gift for me. But what you have to take away is the disempowerment that comes from this. That you have to remove. And God says the only way to relieve yourself of this disempowerment is by loving me. And how do you love me? Well, the fact that we come from God, we therefore can love him. But when we feel that love through the mitzvah of that you should love God, we empower ourselves to love God and to see God as fundamentally inside of us, inside of all of us. So we can't get rid of the problem of Dekesufah, but we can get rid of the disempowerment of what God is. And how do we do that? By the mitzvahs, by doing God's will, by doing exactly what he wants. We say to ourselves, we love God. God has derived us from him and given us the gift of self-perception, the knowledge that we are intrinsic existence. And by doing that, by acceding to this particular concept, we then begin to love God. With our free will, we choose God and we love God. And this removes the problem of Dekesufah. And then we can coexist with God. This is the program of Kessin. What Kessin really wants to do is create us. It allows our creation as a subject. And by correcting Dekesufah, by being masakin Dekesufah, we correct the disempowerment that comes to us as a subject. And this is how we become our own cause for Olam Haba. And this place where we suddenly become a subject and no longer become an object is called Olam Haba. So now we have a clear understanding of Olam Haba and Olam Hazeh. Olam Hazeh exists in a way where we become an object, that we see God as outside because of the fact that we see ourselves as inside. Olam Haba, we become a subject where we now feel our existence from the inside and we feel that we are part of God in terms of the inside. And this is the program of Kessin. Now we understand the program and the nature of the first sphere called Kessin. It deals with the creation of the Zulasai. It deals with the problem of the Zulasai having an issue of perception, that it sees God both as inside and outside, and is not sure what it is. And we see with the creation of a program called the Torah, which has certain mitzvahs. And by doing these mitzvahs, by obeying what God says, by loving God, we free ourselves from the perception that God is outside of us. And we feel the inner love, and therefore we feel the inner sense that we are part of God. So then we go back to a state of being a subject. So this is what it is. This is what it's about. This is the program. The program is to go from existence to manifestation, from being an object to being to being a subject. Because only as a subject can we exist beyond time and so on with God. We cannot do this by being an object. As an object, then our being is one of an extrinsic existence, which cannot be. So I'm going to stop here for this time, and next time I'll continue with the other 9 spheres. But we understand what Kessin is. Kessin designates the problem, and it designates the solution to the problem, or called the Tikkun of Dekesufah. So therefore, Kessin is the highest sphere of all, because it delineates exactly what the issue is and how to solve the problem of the issue. And we see clearly that the issue is called Dekesufah, or the perception of God as an outside, and the solution to the problem is by performing the mitzvahs, by submission to God, and by loving God. We remove the disempowerment that comes from our perception, and suddenly we become a subject again, and we can coexist with God forever. Next time I will go over the other 9 spheres and show how these 9 spheres talk about how this program is implemented so that we can finally coexist with God in Olam Haba. Okay, that's it. Any questions? I admit that this share is not easy to understand.
But it's very, very useful, very helpful.
Was it
Yeah,
clear?
excellent, actually. Yes.
Was it clear?
I hope so.
Very clear.
Okay, but
You have to read.
well, because
Yeah,
it
it's
was
like-
very. What's that?
It's I think it's very welcome because it really gives us the nimshal of the Sefirot and it brings it, makes it real, not some kind of abstract thing.
So do you feel you understand what this is all about, the Kabbalah is all about, clearer than you understood it before?
Yes.
Definitely.
I would advise you to listen to this at least one more time, to review this, to make it very clear. So next time I'm going to
very foundational presentation.
Yeah, I like it. I discussed the essential critical principles of subject and object, intrinsic existence or manifestation, extrinsic existence called existence. I defined all of these things very clearly. Okay, next time I want to teach that the under 9 spheres and so on. And thank you for listening.